Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece for this interview episode, Odysseus Unbound, with Professor James Diggle. We are taking a quick break from the regular series after our look at the development of Corinth to present an interview I recently did with Professor James Diggle from the Odysseus Unbound Foundation. In the series, we have looked at some elements within Greek history that have connections to traditional tales and mythology. Some big examples of these were when we looked at the Trojan War, Mycenae, and the Minoans. Well, once again, we are looking at historical connections to what can be found within the ancient writings of Homer, this time with a focus on the Odyssey. This episode will be focused around the idea of locating the island of Ithaca that Homer describes within the Odyssey. For a long time, controversy has surrounded the actual location of Homers Ithaca, with many since ancient times questioning whether the island we know today as Ithaki was actually the Ithaca of the Odyssey. In our modern time, one such man also questioned this idea. Robert Biddlestone, with a classics, science and economic background, would return from the business world to his love of classics to delve into the mystery around the home island of Odysseus. Robert would develop a working theory that would eventually be presented to an audience at Cambridge University. This is where Professor James Diggle would become involved, seeing great merit in what Robert presented. Professor Diggle would go on to contribute to Robert Biddlestone's book, Odysseus Unbound, The Search for Homers Ithaca. Unfortunately, Robert would pass away in 2015. However, his legacy and work would continue, with the creation of the Odysseus Unbound Foundation, with a number of professionals and academics making up its members, including Robert's sons, Simon and Matthew. The Odysseus Unbound Foundation is an educational charity dedicated to advancing knowledge of the ancient world. Specifically, they conduct and promote scientific and historical research to discover the actual locations of historical sites that have been described in ancient literature, such as Homer's Odyssey. They are committed to publishing widely all their results so that our understanding of the ancient world and the origins of our civilization today are enhanced to everyone's benefit. The foundation was formed in 2017. It is built upon the inspiration of the late Robert Biddlestone, whose groundbreaking ideas about the location of Ithaca, the homeland of Odysseus described by Homer in the Odyssey, are showing significant promise. Professor James Diggle, trustee of the Odysseus Unbound Foundation, is Emeritus Professor of Greek and Latin at Cambridge University and a Life Fellow of Queen's College. His publications include the Cambridge Greek Lexicon, Editor-in-Chief, Cambridge 2021, the Oxford Classical Text of Euripides, Oxford 1981 to 1984, Euripedia, Collected Essays, Oxford 1994, and Theophrastus, Characters, Cambridge 2004. Professor Diggle was a university orator at Cambridge for 11 years and has published a selection of his speeches in Cambridge Orations, Cambridge 1994. He is a Fellow of the British Academy and a corresponding member of the Academy of Athens. He was awarded his CBE in the 2022 New Year's Honours for service to classical scholarship. In this interview with Professor James Diggle, he gives us an insight into the origins of the Odysseus Unbound Foundations before we then cover the aspects around the mystery of locating Homer's Ithaca. Professor Diggle then guides us through the theory that was proposed by Robert Biddlestone and that has continued to guide the Foundation with their continued research. While Professor Diggle then takes us through the evidence that has been accumulated that helps support the theory. Anyway, I hope you find this interview as interesting as I did. And just a note, as this interview was done over Zoom, the quality of the recording does drop off a little bit. Hello everyone, welcome to this interview episode on the Casting Through Ancient Greece podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor James Diggle. Thank you for coming on to the show, Professor Diggle. So today we're going to be looking at probably one of the most, an interesting topic I find is when we mix myth and historical events together. I find this always leads to interesting discussions and points of view and theories developing. And so today we're going to be looking closely at the epic poem, the Odyssey, and through the foundation of Odysseus Unbound, who are looking at trying to identify the historical island of Ithaca. And Professor Diggle is one of the key members involved in the foundation, and so greatly appreciated to have you on the show to talk to us today, Professor Diggle.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you.
So I thought before we do get started, would you be able to just give us a bit of some of your background and your involvement in ancient history and what motivated you to go down this path?
Yes, I've spent my whole time in Cambridge working on Greek literature, not on Homer, but in particular upon Greek tragedy. It was in 2002 that I first got involved in what has become a major undertaking, which is to identify the island of Ithaca. It came about in rather curious circumstances. We had at Queen's, my college, a classical and modern linguists society, which was accustomed to hold annual dinners. And our very enterprising secretary at that time discovered that there was somebody called Robert Bittlestone, who was managing director of a firm called Metapraxis, which had rather curious recruiting methods. It didn't do anything so obvious as to put out advertisements when it wanted to recruit new people. Robert preferred to host meetings or dinners, often at Oxford or Cambridge, to advertise his company and to invite anybody interested to get in touch with him. So the secretary of our society asked if Robert would be prepared to host, that is, finance, a dinner for our society, and he agreed to do that. So, this is in 2002. Robert came along and made a brief presentation about his firm, Metapraxis. Metapraxis is a small company, but a very successful one, which specializes in the detection of early warnings for multinational companies. So we all listened with a glass of wine in our hands as he explained the nature of his company, and at the end he said, in a very non-pressurizing way, if anybody interested in pursuing the possibility of a job with us, just get in touch afterwards. So we then went off to dinner, and I was seated next to Robert, and we had a very genial conversation. He read classics at his public school, Charterhouse, but when he came up to Cambridge, he read economics. Now, after we finished the dinner, I never expected to hear any more from Robert or to meet him again, but suddenly, out of the blue, a year ago later, I got an email from him in which he said, can I come up to Cambridge to put to you a hypothesis which I have formulated about the location of ancient Ithaca? Well, this was a great surprise to me, but courtesy required that I should say yes, why not, come up to Cambridge, and so he did. And one afternoon we met in my rooms in college, and he set out his maps, and he talked about this theory that he'd come up with. Then we went off to dinner at high table, and we resumed after dinner, and we went on till about midnight. Now, what was he talking about? He thought that he could identify ancient Ithaca. Now, you may think, what is the problem here? Isn't there still an island off the west coast of Greece, which the Greeks call Ithaki and we call Ithaca? There is indeed. Well then, isn't this the Ithaca of Odysseus? Well, no, it can't be, as Robert explained, and as many people before him had argued, because Homer's description of the location of Ithaca simply does not square with the location of the present island of Ithaki. Well, I'll explain what precisely his theory was in a moment. But after we had parted at about midnight, I said to him, well, I'll sleep on this and I'll let you know. Well, I probably didn't get much sleep that night. By morning, I was convinced that Robert was onto something. He had come up with a hypothesis which not only explained where Ithaca that is, the Homeric Ithaca is, and why it can't be modern Ithaki. But it also explained why, over the centuries, when people have tried to find a more plausible location for Homers Ithaca, they haven't been able to do so. It was a brilliant and bold hypothesis, and, moreover, it was one that was capable of being either proved or disproved by the application of geoscience.
So I think what would be maybe helpful for a lot of our listeners now as well is just building some context of, obviously we're trying to find historical Ithaca, but in the Odyssey, what's the significance of Ithaca itself and within that poem?
Yeah, well, the Odyssey, long epic poem by Homer, describes the wanderings of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, after the sack of Troy. According to the poem, Odysseus, having fought for 10 years at Troy, was hounded by the sea god Poseidon for a further 10 years. And in the course of his attempts to get back to his homeland of Ithaca, he had lots of adventures. For example, he met the one-eyed Cyclops Polyphemus, Circe, the witch who turns men into pigs, Scylla and Charybdis, Calypso. These folk tales, if you like, you can parallel them from other cultures. We don't believe in them, but Ithaca is a different matter. Ithaca, which is the homeland of Odysseus, is a place that once existed and that must still exist today. There's no doubt at all about that. So you can discard the fantasy, the unreal, the fairy tale elements, and you're still left with a substructure which reflects actual historical fact. I'll say more about that in a moment. People since antiquity have recognized that Homer's description of the location of Ithaca simply does not square with the location of present Ithaki. Now, where does Homer describe ancient Ithaca? He describes it in the ninth book of the Odyssey, when Odysseus is talking to his host, King Alcinous, of the island of Phaeacia, an island which is generally assumed to be the modern Corfu. This is how Odysseus describes the location of Ithaca. He says, around Ithaca, are many islands, close to each other, Dulichion and Sami and wooded Zakynthos. Ithaca itself lies low, furthest to sea towards dusk. The rest, apart, face dawn and sun. Now, we need to get a picture in our minds of the part of Greece that is being described here. We haven't got a map in front of us, but I will try to describe the area that we're talking about. It's not too difficult.
All right, I'll put up a map on the website as well so people can try and follow along.
Right. Oh, good. Greece is divided into two parts. You've got the lower part, the Peloponnese, and that is divided from the upper part of Greece, the larger area, by the Corinth Canal. Now, as you follow the Corinth Canal towards the west, then you come to a group of islands in the so-called Ionian Sea. The one closest to the coast is the modern Ithaki. To the west of that is the much larger island of Kephallonia, and immediately below Kephallonia is the island of Zakynthos. Now, with that configuration of the present group of islands in mind, let's just go back to Homer's description through the mouth of Odysseus of the location of Ithaca. I'll read the relevant lines again, and then I'll explain what the implication of them is. Odysseus says, around are many islands, close to each other. Dulichion and Sami and wooded Zakynthos. Ithaca itself lies low, furthest to sea towards dusk. The rest apart face dawn and sun. Now, this description gives us three important pieces of information, three clues to the location of Homeric Ithaca. First, it tells us that Ithaca is one of a group of islands, of which the others are Dulichion and Sami and Zakynthos. Second, it tells us that Ithaca is the island furthest west of these islands. And third, it tells us that Ithaca is low-lying. Now, first of all, can we identify any of these islands? Well, we can start with Zakynthos. Everybody accepts that Homer's Zakynthos is the same as the island that has that name today. A little more difficult is Sami. Scholars in antiquity identified Sami with the modern island, or the ancient island, it had that name in antiquity, of Kephallonia. On Kephallonia there is, and always has been since antiquity, a town called Sami. So, almost certainly, Homer's Sami is what was later known as Kephallonia. This leaves us two islands still to find, and here is the beginning of the mystery, or one element in the mystery. We've got two islands still to find, Dulichion and Ithaca. Now, if Ithaki is Ithaca, where is Dulichion? Where an island short? Let's look at the second of these three clues. The Homeric description said that Ithaca was the island furthest west, literally furthest to sea towards dusk. That is, furthest west, out to sea. Is Ithaki furthest west, furthest out to sea of these islands? No, indeed not. Ithaki is the furthest east of these islands, close to the mainland of Greece. Third, the Homeric description said that Ithaca was low-lying. Is Ithaki low-lying? No, it's a mountainous island with cliffs plunging sheer into the sea. So this is our problem. This is the problem that Robert Bittleston faced, and that had been indeed faced by many people before him. So, what's our answer to this problem? Are we to accuse Homer of geographical ignorance, or suspect that he's invented an island that never existed? Well, Robert came up with a quite brilliant hypothesis.
I thought before we continue with Robert's hypothesis, obviously you said that there's been a lot of contention around Ithaki being the historical Ithaca. What other attempts had been made to try and locate the historical island of Ithaca?
Oh, many attempts, going right back to antiquity, because even writers in antiquity realized that there was a problem with Homer's description. If we come closer to modern times, just to give you one or two examples, there is a celebrated German archaeologist, Wilhelm Dirkfeld, who spent many years excavating the island of Lefkas. Now, Lefkas stands immediately above Kefalonia and Ithaca, and he confidently declared that Lefkas was Ithaca, but despite many, many years of archaeological investigation, he could not find any evidence to support his theory. This is not at all surprising. Is Lefkas the furthest west of this group of islands? No, indeed, it's not. It's the furthest north. Other people, quite a lot, have suggested, well, it's actually Kefalonia that was the ancient Ithaca. The problem here is that if you look at the map of Kefalonia, you will see that Kefalonia consists of two parts. The much larger eastern part is joined at the north by a narrow strip of land to the smaller western part. And this western part, which is today called Haliki, after its ancient capital city, Halis. Now, Kefalonia, taken as a whole, fits one of our clues. West, but not the eastern part, which, like Ithaki, is mountainous. It has a mountain called Ainos, which rises to a height of 1,600 meters. It's only the western part, the peninsula of Paliki, that lies low. So, could it be that we've missed a vital clue?
I'm assuming that's where Robert's theory comes in to provide some more insight and another direction to look in.
Yes. Robert found a vital clue in the geographical writer Strabo. Now, Strabo wrote a very, very long work on the geography of the whole of the then known world in 17 books. He hadn't visited the whole of the then known world himself. He relied upon earlier writers, writers who knew what they were talking about. And when he came to describe the geography of Kefalonia, this is what he said: where the island is narrowest, it forms an isthmus so low-lying that it is often submerged from sea to sea. In other words, water was still flowing through a channel separating two parts of Kefalonia in his own day, or rather, in the day of the earlier authorities whom he is citing, and they may have lived a couple of hundred years before him. So Robert, taking note of this description by Strabo, said, just suppose that in the late Bronze Age, shall we say 1200 BC, that narrow channel that Strabo describes, which, as he says, forms an isthmus so low-lying that it is often submerged from sea to sea. Just suppose that in 1200 BC, that channel was wider and was actually navigable, and that Kefalonia, as a consequence, was not, as it later became, one single island, but two separate islands with this channel dividing them. If that can be shown to be the case, then the western peninsula of Paliki will fit all the Homeric clues. The peninsula of Paliki will be the furthest island to the west, facing the sea. We shall have gained that missing island. You remember, we couldn't find an island to square with Dulichion if Ithaki was Ithaca. The modern Ithaki will be Dulichion. All our pieces fall into place. Now, the beauty of this hypothesis is that it can be tested. I mean, as I said to Robert immediately when I got in touch with him again, I said, all you need now is a geologist, a geoscientist, to advise you on whether it simply is feasible that in this narrow valley, the Thenia Valley that separates the two parts of Kephallonia, whether there could have been at one time, say 1200 BC, a navigable channel. I mean, when you look at the Thenia Valley, you think, that could never have been a navigable channel. But Robert's hypothesis, founded on that clue provided by Strabo, was that in 1200 BC, that was a wider and navigable channel. So that is the start of the investigations, which are still ongoing, and which we believe very, very soon we shall bring to a successful conclusion.
So how long ago did these investigations begin into trying to find some evidence of this theory ringing true?
Immediately after my meeting with Robert and my suggesting to him that he needed to find a geologist, Robert, an extremely enterprising man, as you can imagine, immediately discovered who was the world expert on the geology of Kephallonia. It was John Underhill, Professor of Geology in the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. So Robert immediately contacted him and put to him his hypothesis as he had put it to me. And just as I was, John Underhill was convinced that there was something here worth investigating. So John came on board, did a great deal of geological investigation of the area where Robert had posited that the channel existed. And by 2005, we were able to publish a book, that is, Odysseus Unbound, primarily written by Robert, but with contributions by me and John Underhill, in which the theory was fully explained, and the geology, as far as we had been able to take it up to that time, was also laid out. We made in that book a very, very strong case for the existence of Paliki in the late Bronze Age as a separate island, which might be identified with the Homeric island of Ithaca. The book received a great deal of attention. The theory was widely discussed and gained a great deal of support in the academic world. But there did remain a great deal more work that needed to be done to turn what was a very plausible theory into one which can be said to have been proved. Now, Robert, alas, died in 2015, but we were keen to continue the scientific work that needed to be done, and Robert's sons were equally keen that we should do that. And so they, John Underhill and I, together with one or two others who had been helping us, formed in 2017 the Odysseus Unbound Foundation. The work which needed to be done was going to involve a lot of people, not just we ourselves, but experts in a variety of disciplines, seismologists, experts in marine fossils. It was going to involve the drilling of boreholes, and this was going to be expensive. We set up the Odysseus Unbound Foundation, therefore, a charitable foundation, in order to raise the funds to finance this work. And we have brought it very close to a successful conclusion.
So what sort of methods have been put in place to try and actually prove some of the theories? Like you mentioned, you had seismologists and geologists. What sort of measures have they done to try and prove some of the theories that Robert had come up with?
We drilled a great many boreholes, both in the Mycenae Valley and offshore in the sea, partly with the help of a Dutch geoscientific company called Fugro, who very generously sponsored our work for a good many years. From those boreholes, we were able to recover, among other things, microfossils. Now, microfossils are datable, and we made one very significant discovery. A microfossil, which is a marine microfossil, that is, it's carried only by the sea. We found this in the landfill material, which occupied the Mycenae Valley. Now, how did a marine-borne fossil, microfossil, get into this land-based material? It could only have done so if at one time there had been water passing through that valley. Now, the other thing that I haven't yet mentioned, but this is vitally important, is the initial theory, the filling in of this channel, was based on the assumption that all the landfill material came down from the valley sides, precipitated by seismic events, by earthquakes. Kefalonia is the most seismically active area almost in the whole of the world, because Kefalonia stands at a place where the Eurasian tectonic plate collides with the African tectonic plate. Two continents, that is under the water, are colliding with each other right under Kefalonia. And that is the reason why Kefalonia has suffered throughout its history from so many earthquakes. The most recent large earthquake happened in 1953. It was a huge earthquake which devastated pretty well the whole of Kefalonia, all its buildings. Now, amazingly, if you follow that fault line, the place where the two continents meet, from its western end, which is under Kefalonia, to its eastern end, you'll find that its eastern end comes out at that place on the shore of Turkey, which has recently suffered such a devastating earthquake, in which there have been thousands and thousands of catastrophes. So, we assumed, John Underhill assumed, that the reason why the channel had been filled in was that material had been precipitated down into the channel area from the surrounding hills by one or other major earthquakes. In the years that followed, we have been able to refine that theory. The theory was correct, but many further movements of the earth, the infilling rock, have been detected. An awful lot of movement happened in that area, and we have been able now, with the help partly of ground-penetrating radar and other techniques, to trace the precise path of the channel that once existed. To put together all the scientific material that we have discovered is quite a difficult and lengthy task, but we've almost finished it. So in a scientific journal very soon we shall publish all the scientific evidence that we believe will corroborate Robert's hypothesis. And once that has been done, I don't think that it will be possible for anyone to dispute that Haliki was the ancient Ithaca. Everything fits together.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of time and work and money's had to have gone into investigating a lot of the theories that were presented to you all those years ago to arrive at the point you are at now. So I guess one thing is interesting is obviously the whole mystery began first because of trying to connect a historical element to an epic poem that exists in myth, but there's also historical elements there. So how much stock can we put into the Odyssey itself as providing the clues to an ancient Ithaca?
Yeah, well, there was a time when Troy was believed never to have existed, that people thought it was just a poetic fiction, the story of the Trojan War. Then Heinrich Schliemann discovered Troy, and subsequent excavation confirmed that Troy was destroyed by foreign attackers around the time that Homer describes, that is, around 1200 BC. Now, the leader of the expedition against Troy was Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and Homer describes Mycenae as rich in gold. Schliemann located Mycenae and discovered its gold. Before the time of the Trojan War, according to legend, King Minoans ruled a mighty empire from Knossos on the island of Crete. Sir Arthur Evans excavated Knossos and discovered a great palace. So, the Homeric poems reflect a period, the so-called Late Bronze Age, the Mycenaean Age, traces of which have been found by archaeologists. So there is a substratum of historical and geographical reality in the Homeric poems.
I was just going to say, yeah, we found a very similar line of thinking when I had a talk with Professor Eric Klein, and we looked at elements of the Trojan War, and as more and more documents from the Hittite Empire have been translated, we're actually finding that what's presented in myth seems to align with what could have historically been taking place as well. But obviously, we're finding the same thing with Mycenae and the discovery of Troy itself. And so why can't this be applied to the Odyssey itself as well?
Yes. I mean, one question that has to be faced is, how could it be that a poem, the Odyssey, which was composed maybe in 700 BC, when Kefalonia almost certainly was a single island, nevertheless reflects a geographical situation in which Kefalonia was two islands? Well, the answer lies in the origins of the Odyssey. The Odyssey we call an epic poem, but it's not like an epic poem of the sort that Virgil's Aeneid or Milton's Paradise Lost is. These poems were written for reading public, and we know precisely when and in what circumstances they were written and who wrote them. Now, the Greeks attributed the Iliad and the Odyssey to a poet whom they called Homer, but they knew no more about Homer than we do. We don't know when and in what circumstances the Odyssey was composed. What we do know is that, to begin with, it was not designed for reading. The poems couldn't have been written down much before 700 BC, because the Greeks didn't acquire their written alphabet, which is adapted from the Phoenician script until the 8th century. It is possible that the poems were not actually written down until a century later, say 600 BC. But although they weren't written down until this later period, they have their origins much earlier in a pre-literate society where poetry was composed by highly trained singers or bards. In the Odyssey, we have a couple of these. We have an oidos, a singer, a bard, called Phemios at the court of Odysseus, and another one called Eumodicus at the court of the Phaeacian king Alcinous. We can be pretty confident that a tradition of oral poetry existed in Mycenaean times, that is, at the time of the events which are described in the poems. Now, the most obvious indication that these poems are in origin oral poems comes from one stylistic feature of them. They use repeated formulae, repeated phrases. For example, take the word for ship. Ships are never simply ships. They're usually swift ships, or black ships, or well-built ships. And the epithet which a ship is given on a particular occasion is dictated not by sense, that is, not by deliberate selection, but by the needs of grammar and meter, because each of these phrases that I've given you has a different metrical or grammatical function. These are examples of the simplest formulaic phrases. There are countless others, longer and more complex, and these provide the building blocks from which the poet composes his verses. The poet has in his repertoire a vast stock of expressions which will cover many of his needs, and from this stock he can take with little conscious effort, as he composes, the expression which meter and grammar requires. And this not only helps in the creation of new poetry, it helps, what is vitally important, in the preservation of older poetry. For example, once you've described an object or a place in several lines of verse, there's no reason to change that description. It becomes part of the poetical heritage, easily memorized and available for use by poets of the next generation. This is the reason why we can be confident that the Odyssey contains echoes of geographical features, circumstances of civilization, which existed many centuries before the time the actual poems were written down.
Yes, and I've obviously noticed the same thing when you read through the Iliad and the Odyssey. When you see key figures, heroes, and gods, you also see those epithets that also follow with them in that same example that you're speaking of. And you can see how it would make for much greater recall as the stories are passed down, where I guess the stories can be passed down in a more accurate manner, retaining their key information as opposed to just a story that didn't have these elements involved with it. So obviously this provides a good foundation to build the theory on, and we've gone through Robert's theory, outlined it all. We've gone through the evidence that points to backing up this theory as well. Obviously there's more work that you've alluded to that's going to be taking place, but has there been opposition to the theory that you've put out there? I'm thinking of one key island that may have some backlash.
Yes, you're quite right. Well, naturally, the current inhabitants of the island of Ithaki will have no sympathy with our theory, because if our theory is correct, then they will have lost their claim to Odysseus. And, one can feel very sympathetic to their wish not to lose their claim to Odysseus, to being the Homeric island of Ithaca. But unfortunately, they forfeit some of the sympathy I otherwise would have felt by the methods with which they have attempted to counter ours. Robert and I, and John too, just around the time of the publication of the book, gave many presentations, both in this country and in Greece. And a couple of presentations in Greece I'll mention. One of them was in Argostoli, which is the capital city of the eastern part of Kephallonia. Now, the eastern part of Kephallonia, as opposed to the western part, Paliki, being much closer to Ithaki than is Paliki, also seems to be, in terms of temperament, rather more aligned to Ithaki than Paliki is. Well, we went to Argostoli, the capital of eastern Kephallonia, and made our presentation. And as soon as we'd finished, somebody jumped up from the front row. Clearly, he'd come across from neighboring Ithaki. And he said, "I think this is just a Scottish joke." And John Underhill, who you remember, was Professor of Geology in the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, replied with the most brilliant off-the-cuff riposte. He immediately said, "There are two things you need to know. First, I am not Scottish. Second, the Scots have no sense of humour." There was another occasion in the Monarchy Museum in Athens, this wonderful, wonderful museum. We had an enormous crowd attending, and Robert and I made our presentation. And we could see that the front rows were occupied by people from Ithaki who were itching to express their opposition. So we knew what was coming. But as soon as we'd finished, when the chairman invited questions, immediately the hands went up from the front row. It wasn't questions they were interested in asking. Instead, they started haranguing us about the perversity of this hypothesis. Well, eventually, people behind them, who a very large number of people behind them, the majority of the persons present, who were sympathetic to our ideas, became impatient with these noisy Ithacans in the front rows and told them to sit down and shut up. It almost came to fisticuffs. I mean, Robert and I just sat there and we smiled and let them get on with it. We thought, happily, things calmed down.
Just out of interest, I mean, we said earlier on that there had been opposition to the idea of Ithaki being ancient Ithaca in the first place. What actually led to Ithaki being labelled as of Odysseus's home island?
Once the two islands, Paliki and Eastern Cephalonia, became merged into one island, then you had lost Ithaca. You had to find Ithaca. Ithaca was so important to the Greeks. The name Ithaca became transferred then to the island which originally, that is in the Homeric poems, was called Dulichion. Dulichion was a much less significant name than Ithaca. It was not surprising, therefore, that because you had to have an Ithaca, the name Ithaca became transferred to the only island that was available to take its name, that is, Dulichion. Now, this is not merely a far-fetched speculation. There is evidence that the modern island of Ithaki was once called Dulichion. Roman poets used the name Dulichia of Odysseus's island. There was by that time, by Roman times, some confusion. And Dulichion, Dulichia as it was in Latin, and Ithaca were somehow merged in the same island. The name Dulichion continued to be applied to the modern Ithaki into medieval times. We can find early maps which label Ithaki as Dulichion.
So there's, I guess this is brings us sort of full circle again back to where we began, but shows where the mystery does come into being and why even back in ancient times that it was present. So that's very interesting. So obviously you said that there's still some work to be done. What are the plans going forward now with the foundation and further work around the island of Ithaca?
We've also begun to do some archaeological work in association with the local effort of antiquities. Earlier, our work was purely geological, but we're keen to identify, if we can, the place where the palace of Odysseus would have stood. Assuming that Paliki is Ithaca, then there must have been a palace, as described in the Odyssey, at least, a seat, a place where the ruler lived. We don't have to suppose he was called Odysseus. Odysseus may be a fictional name, but we assume that there was a Mycenaean community of some importance. Otherwise, we would never have had Odysseus and Ithaca in the Odyssey. So we assume that there was a Mycenaean settlement on Paliki, and we have been able to identify a place which we think is the most plausible place where the ruler would have put his palace. In Mycenaean times, you built your palaces on high ground, on acropolises. And we have identified one such acropolis, which we think is a very good candidate for the location of the palace. Now, one day, we hope it will be possible to do some excavation in that area. In the meantime, in a very nearby area, we have begun excavations with the effort of archaeology to discover more Mycenaean tombs. Mycenaean tombs have been discovered there in the past. Alas, they have been rifled before they were discovered. But by the use of ground-penetrating radar, we think that we have been able to identify other tombs still underground. If we're right, and we can excavate them, they are likely to have been unrifled, and goodness knows what marvels they may contain. Well, all this is designed to demonstrate that the island of Paliki was an important center of Mycenaean civilization. This is a long-term project. It will take time and money, of course, to excavate.
So that's the future plans that are coming up. And I understand that you've got some stuff coming out in a journal this year, is it?
We hope this year, if not this year, then next. It will all be very, very technical. The scientific arguments that will be produced by John Underhill and his colleagues will be of a nature that will require publication in a very technical geoscientific journal, but naturally we shall publicize this in a more accessible form in the media.
Yep. So that was, I guess, what's going to be presented is along the lines of what we've briefly gone over with the evidence to do with the theory, and that will be outlined in a more technical sense, I guess is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of it, and I bet it's a very exciting time for everyone involved at the foundation with what happens in the future. So yeah, what can people that are interested in the theory and following along, what can they do to find out more, and how can they get involved to help with the foundation?
We have a website which can be found very easily. Just Google Odysseus Unbound or www.odysseus-unbound.org. So you get our website, and it contains a great deal of information about what we have done in the past and what we are proposing to do in the future. And it also shows how you can support us. We have a system of so-called friends and patrons who have pledged to offer various levels of financial support. And so anybody who wishes to offer us such support, we shall naturally be extremely grateful for it.
Yeah, it sounds like a very interesting, worthwhile endeavor as well. And I look forward to following along to see what comes out in the future as we move forward. Well, thank you, Professor James Diggle, for coming on and explaining the theory behind Homers Ithaca and perhaps why it has been identified in the wrong island, but has been very interesting, and I look forward to following along and seeing what further research develops. But once again, thanks for coming on to share all your work and knowledge with us.
It's been a great pleasure.
Well, that was the interview with Professor James Diggle on the work that the Odysseus Unbound Foundation has been involved in. I hope you found the talk around the mystery, theory, and the evidence that has been established as interesting and thought-provoking as I did. If you're interested in finding out more about the Foundation and the work they are pursuing, you can head over to their website at www.odysseus-unbound.org. www.odysseus-unbound.org, where a great deal of information can be found. Also, you can follow Odysseus Unbound on Facebook, but they also have a YouTube channel you can check out. I've also put out links on the episode page and in the show notes. Thank you all for your continued support, and I greatly appreciate you tuning in each episode. Next episode, we will be getting back to our narrative, where we had left it after the Samian War, when we took a couple of episodes to look at the development of the polis of Corinth through its early history. This will now see us moving forward from 439 BC towards the breakout of the Peloponnesian War. I hope you look forward to tuning back in next time with episode 67, The Athenian Empire.